Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 583, A Beach Full of Fairies. This episode of CraftLit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well, and I have links for you. Holy smoke. Episode 583 on the craftlit.com site might work if you type in craftlit.com/583, but we're still working out the kinks on that. I'm going to create a feedback form for the craftlit.com website that I can then send directly to the guys who are working on the website. I think hearing from all y'all might help me help them understand some of what's still wonky with the site. So there's that. That link will be, if you cannot get it, at craftlit.com. That will be at libsyn.craftlit.com. And again, it's episode 583, being released on Friday, March 18th, 2022. So on the Libsyn site, you can see most easily, you can see the year on the sidebar, and then you click on the year, and then it'll give you months. So it would be 2022, and then it would be 3, would be March, and then 318 will get you episode 583. Okay, that housekeeping aside, woo, I have linky fun for you. So I'm going to go through these in the order in which I wrote them down. And I hope that's okay with you, because I don't know another way to do it. Okay, so first, True Tales from Old Houses is a really, really cool podcast that Dianne from Holiday Vacations turned me on to. And as if that wasn't enough, Dianne is on True Tales from Old Houses, episode number 71. There's a link to it in the show notes. And Dianne's interview starts around the 5-minute and 27-second mark. She is talking about a different trip to Ireland in that episode, but a lot of the Ireland that she talks about is our Ireland too. And if you want to get the details on the CraftLit tour to Ireland coming this October, seats are still available. You can go to holidayvacations.com. The page is going to open up. It's a longer page than what you see, but it's going to open up showing you the top part of their longer webpage. Towards the bottom of what you see, not scrolling, but what you see immediately, automatically, you will see a tab that says Local Stations Keyword. Click on Local Station Keyword, and in the search tab that opens there, enter the word CraftLit, all one word, CraftLit, and that will take you straight on over to me smiling at you, and then you'll be able to get all the details on the trip. I am so excited that we are actually going to be able to do this. Very, very cool. There is also an image on the show notes for this episode 583 that will show you visually how to find that place on the holidayvacations.com site so that you can search for and access the tour brochure. Second, Michelle Malone. You have heard me talk about the Indigo Girls before, and Andrew went to college with them, and they did music for his shows, and he went and saw them every night, and it was a big love fest. Well, there's a corollary. Michelle Malone came up at the same time as them, was playing the same kind of clubs, knew Amy and Emily, and has continued to make music on a slightly lower key than the Indigo Girls, but has continued to make music nonetheless. She's released a new album, and I have a link to an article about that album, and one of the songs, I think it's what would have been the A-side of the first release of the 45. For those of you old enough to remember 45s. Anyway, if you want to listen to it, I love her voice. It's deep and it's soulful, and her music is a lot of fun, and Andrew and I got to take Thing 2 down to Atlanta to see Michelle Malone in concert, and Thing 2 got to meet her, and it was really, really sweet because Thing 2 has been working on the music. He is on Spotify. He has released several songs now. I will put a link to his Spotify there as well. I think his songs are also in the iTunes or the Apple Music, I guess it's Apple Music now, Apple Music Store. And back before I started up with Joan, there was, and back before Thing 2's Mamma Mia premiere, which was last weekend, Thing 2 did an open mic night at a local, it's not really a club, it's a vintage record. So I guess all records are vintage, more or less. A vintage vinyl store with some other memorabilia kind of things going on there. So, there are guitars that were owned by actual rock stars that are for sale and all sorts of cool stuff. Anyway, have to say, Thing 2 did an extraordinary job at the open mic night. Everybody else who was playing was an adult and had been there before, and they were all varying levels of, that's nice. And then my little schnookums gets up and does a performance. So instead of mumbling, this is a song I wrote about drugs, but it's ironic, Thing 2 gets up and performs a song that has a start, a finish, a middle, an end, a bridge. I have not been as proud of that kid, maybe ever, because it takes some serious cojones to get up when everybody else in the room is 20 years older than you and do what they did. So yay for that. The open mic nights happen every first Friday of every month and are allegedly streamed, or at least the audio video is shared on Facebook. I have not been able to find this, but next time we go, I'm going to ask for the link, or for the owner to at least show me the link so that I can come back and share it with you. If you are listening to this out of time, if you're listening to this later, then this is probably old news. The Ukraine situation is tense. It is ongoing. It is very, 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 very sad and extremely frustrating. We have a friend whose son is an officer in the military, and she hasn't talked to him since right before the Russians showed up. He was stationed in Kiev. So we are all nervous and stressed. And if you haven't seen it, I have linked out to Arnold Schwarzenegger. He released on his Twitter feed a video speaking directly to the Russian people. It's an incredible piece of kind of personal talk to the camera audio and video, because Schwarzenegger knows how to perform. And wow, I didn't know a lot of what he talks about. So that was kind of incredible. And then LeAnn on the Thursday night Zoom chat shared another video where John Green of the John and Hank Green, the Vlog Brothers, they've been online doing educational videos for a long time now. He explains the Ukrainian situation, which is complicated, and does a kind of an unsparing look at the history of how we got where we are. And if you are confused by the whole situation, watch the video. It'll make more sense. We also have a couple of book recommendations from the Zoom call this week. Carmen said there's a book, but also a play that she was able to see called Hello Girls, and it's about America's first soldiers. They were not given veterans benefits until the 70s, but these are ladies who worked in the war, World War I, that started in World War I and then continued, and it took them until the 70s to get their benefits. That's just ridiculous, but not entirely surprising. So that was a disappointment, but a cool story. And I've already downloaded the book. The audio version is on our Hoopla with our current library. I know other people are lucky enough to be able to use Libby with their libraries. I am not. I am still stuck on Hoopla. C'est la guerre. First world problems. LeAnn on the Zoom call shared two, what she said are, I have not tried them yet, although I have ordered one of them so far, excellent vegetarian cookbooks. One is called East, and one is the Essential Indian Instant Pot Cookbook. Those are linked to from the show notes as well. Thing 2 had a bit of a kerfuffle. I think I mentioned last summer, what were we doing? Northanger Abbey? or Tenant of Wildfell Hall. I can't remember anymore. The last 2 years have just blurred into oblivion in my brain. It's kind of like sticking time into a Cuisinart and pushing chop. Thing 2 slid down the basement stairs and broke a quart mason jar with the side of his foot. Basically the part of your foot where you would get a bunion if you were going to get a bunion. Thing 2 wound up not just getting glass embedded in the foot that took a long time to come out, but also chipping off a chunk of that bone, that bunion bone. So surgery in November, surgical site opened up in January, which was a little stressful. And then this week, surgical site turned bright red and swelled. So either, we don't know yet, either it was osteomyelitis, which is a bone infection, which is very scary, or cellulitis, which is kind of an internal cellular skin related, but inside skin infection, or gout. That's right. So one of those things is true. They pack this kid so full of antibiotics, and I'm packing the kid so full of yogurt. They packed him so full of antibiotics and gout drugs that something worked, but we don't know what. However, preemptively, or I guess potentially post-emptively, we won't know for a while, Thing 2 decided to go vegetarian because that is largely what the anti-gout diet is like. It's no red meat, no shellfish, very little fish in general, chicken occasionally, but mostly vegetarian. And they've been talking about going vegetarian for a while, so LeAnn's cookbooks are definitely going to help with that. Plus, I may not have to cook dinner because Thing 2 is going to have to do some cooking here, which is fine with me. And also Andrew won't have to cook dinner because Andrew was doing a lot of that while I was in deep in the contact tracing training trenches and working long, long days. What have I been listening to when I haven't been listening to Joan of Arc? Because the world is crazy and upsetting, I've been listening to a lot of Terry Pratchett. And one of the things that sounds contradictory but will make sense if you listen to any of the books, death is a lovely character. In the book Hogfather, which is a Discworld novel, death is a character in Discworld, Terry Pratchett's Discworld. Death has, I think, one of the greatest philosophical statements about humans ever. And I've linked out to the video so that you can see it. It starts, there was a movie, like a 4-part movie made of the book Hogfather with Lady Mary from Downton Abbey, which is kind of awesome. This is what she did before Downton Abbey. I've linked to that scene. It'll start right at the beginning of the conversation. And in case you can't get the video where you are, or you can't stream it, I have also linked out to the scene written out for you. And when I showed the scene to Andrew, he said, oh, this is interesting because this kind of overlaps nicely with a book that he's currently reading called Collective Illusions by Todd Rose, which he said also overlaps nicely with HumanKind, which is the book I talked about maybe a year ago, that just makes you feel better about humanity in general. Collective Illusions is a related type of book telling us more about who we are and that we really aren't as awful as we seem to be all the time. And he said it also overlaps interestingly with the book Thinking Fast and Slow, which I know I talked about when he read it, which was several years ago. Along with the death novels, of which there are several, I have also listened or re-listened to We Free Men, WEEFREE, men, because they are we. They are little blue men. The We Free Men and all the rest of the Tiffany Aching books. If you aren't sure where to start listening to or reading the Terry Pratchett books, I highly recommend the advice that I was given by my good friend Jonathan, which was start with We Free Men and Tiffany Aching. She's funny, she's accessible. They are young adult books. So if you're listening with young people in the car, there's nothing questionable in there that you can't listen to. Also, I think the last Tiffany Aching book is the last book Terry Pratchett wrote and completed before he passed away. A lot of comfort listening can be found in the Terry Pratchett books because while he is ironic and silly, he is also very, very serious about what he is saying in his stories. And what he has to say is good and smart and includes thoughts like justice and fairness and hope and love and all of the things we say are important to us. So there's that. And then I also included for you a link to a graphic of the entire Terry Pratchett pantheon organized by, it's not really by theme, it's by collection. So like the Tiffany Aching books are all in order on this graphic, or the death novels all go in order, and it shows you where the first book in that particular series, that collection, is, and then you can move through them and on to something else. I'm currently in the middle of Discworld's Industrial Revolution right now, which I get such a kick out of. So that's everything for you. That's all of the links I've collected. That's all of the interesting tidbits that I pulled from the Zoom chat last night. And yeah, so now it's time for Mark Twain and Joan of Arc. Okay, last week I mentioned that this week's episode has a long chapter. It is a longer chapter. It's about 25 minutes to listen to, I think. And if you tend to listen to the chapters at speed, where you speed up the audio a little bit, this is one where I would actually take the speed back to normal. I just think that there are some important pauses and moments that will get lost and missed if you are listening at speed. Because one of the things the audio player does is it cuts out empty space. It reduces silence. It kind of listens ahead to the audio that's coming. And I don't know how it does that. It's magic. And then eliminates the spaces between the words. That's why it doesn't make it sound like a chipmunk when it speeds up. So that's the first thing. Listen to it in regular time. Second thing, a reminder that Domremy, where Joan of Arc was born, where she lived, and where her family lived, and where her family's house still stands, her family and the people she hung out with, they weren't really impoverished. They weren't peasants. Some of them, I'm sure, were shepherds, but they weren't all. So Twain has mythologized some parts of Joan's childhood, and that's one of them that you will hear in this chapter. There's also, because it is Mark Twain, there's some language that doesn't get used very often. However, some of these words weren't used very often when he was kicking around either. He went back and tries to pull from older and often archaic language as well. So one of those terms that you are going to hear is a tierce, Tierce. This doesn't get used very often. It's a description word of a cask or a container that's round. It will make sense when you hear that. It also happens to be roughly 42 gallons, and 42 gallons-ish in American measurements is what we call a drum of oil. So when we talk about so many barrels of oil or so many drums of oil, a barrel of oil, 42 gallons, a tierce. That's one. An anchor fluke. I have read about anchors before on the podcast. I don't remember talking about an anchor fluke. I have linked out from the show notes to an image at Encyclopedia Britannica of an anchor, and the parts of the anchor are all labeled and named, and one of those parts is a fluke. If you think about the anchor as a T with the crossbar with a smiley face smile at the bottom of the T, each end of the smiley face has the little arrow tip on it so that the anchor can snag on, rocks or something on the floor of the ocean or lake or river, wherever you are, and you're trying to anchor yourself. That little spear tip, that little pointy bit on the ends of the smiley face portion of the anchor, that's an anchor fluke. I don't remember learning that before, but I thought that was kind of cool. There are several, they're not tropes, they're not memes, several concepts that Twain will return to over and over during the course of this novel. One of which is definitely part of Huck Finn as well, which is kids don't get stuff out of thin air. We learn, you already heard it in the preface in the first chapter, we learn prejudice secondhand. We learn it as children from adults, if we're going to learn it at all. So that's one maybe it's a motif actually in this book that he comes back to frequently. The other one, and you're going to hear a lot of it in this chapter because this chapter is 1,000% foreshadowing. Opinions. Opinions versus evidence and fact. Wow, I didn't think about how important that whole motif would be when we went through the novel, but studies are now coming out about disinformation campaigns and the people that they've killed and the damage that they've done over the course of the last 2 years. And oh, Twain must be spinning right now in horror and upset because it's certainly something that he was speaking out against in his books. You will hear a reference to some of the kids. Pierre Morel, that was one of the kids who got mentioned by name in the previous chapters. And you will also hear Edmund Aubrey. Edmund Aubrey's father is the mayor, and Edmund Aubrey's mother was Joan of Arc's godmother. And she actually matters. She is mentioned in today's chapters, but she was also mentioned in the trial, the first trial of Joan of Arc, and accused of having either been a witch or something. There was something going on, and therefore Joan must have learned witchcraft from her, was where the prosecution was trying to go. Joan deflected that rather nicely, but she matters. She is by name. She is a real person. A reminder that Joan's, or Jeanne d'Arc, our Joan, is the daughter of Jacques d'Arc. So he gets mentioned shortly after the kid gets mentioned, and I had to kind of remember, oh yeah, that's her dad. So just in case, I wanted to save you the same consternation that I felt. I mentioned before that in this first of the 3 parts of the Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc book, that the first part is the one that has been most Twainified as far as the writing goes and some of the language goes. These children do not sound like young French children. They definitely sound like young children who are characters in a Mark Twain late 1800s Midwest and Southern novel. And one of the places where that happens is our narrator, Louis de Camp, says, I knew he was going to drop corn along in front of Joan now. He was going to drop corn, like make a trail of corn like you would for a chicken to get them to follow you. Just dropping breadcrumbs for Joan to follow along. And it works its way into a huge piece of foreshadowing, but also he works it kind of nice into a description of how foolish this person was to think that they could lead Joan on and trap her in an argument, because she's Joan, and sorry, you can't do that. And Twain's point in this chapter is, and you couldn't have done that even when Joan was very young. And you definitely couldn't do that when Joan was 17, 18, 19, and on trial for her life. All right, that's everything I think you might need before we get into the chapter. So here we go with chapter 2. I know it seems ridiculous. It's just chapter 2, but it's a big one, of Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain, read for us by John Greenman. Here we go.
Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain. Chapter 2, The Fairy Tree of Domremy. Our Domremy was like any other humble little hamlet of that remote time and region. It was a maze of crooked narrow lanes and alleys, shaded and sheltered by the overhanging thatch roofs of the barn-like houses. The houses were dimly lighted by wooden-shuttered windows, that is, holes in the walls which served for windows. The floors were dirt, and there was very little furniture. Sheep and cattle grazing was the main industry. All the young folks tended flocks. The situation was beautiful. From one edge of the village a flowery plain extended in a wide sweep to the river, the Meuse. From the rear edge of the village a grassy slope rose gradually, and at the top was the great oak forest, a forest that was deep and gloomy and dense, and full of interest for us children, for many murders had been done in it by outlaws in old times, and in still earlier times Prodigious dragons that spouted fire and poisonous vapors from their nostrils had their homes in there. In fact, one was still living in there in our own time. It was as long as a tree, and had a body as big around as a tierce, and scales like overlapping great tiles, and deep ruby eyes as large as a cavalier's hat, and an anchor fluke on its tail as big as I don't know what, but very big, even unusually so for a dragon, as everybody said who knew about dragons. It was thought that this dragon was of a brilliant blue color, with gold mottlings, but no one had ever seen it, therefore this was not known to be so, it was only an opinion. It was not my opinion. I think there is no sense in forming an opinion when there is no evidence to form it on. If you build a person without any bones in him, he may look fair enough to the eye, but he will be limber and cannot stand up, and I consider that evidence is the bones of an opinion. But I will take up this matter more at large at another time, and try to make the justness of my position appear. As to that dragon, I always held the belief that its color was gold and without blue, for that has always been the color of dragons. That this dragon lay but a little way within the wood at one time is shown by the fact that Pierre Morel was in there one day and smelt it, and recognized it by the smell. It gives one a horrid idea of how near to us the deadliest danger can be, and we not suspect it. In the earliest times 100 knights from many remote places in the earth would have gone in there one after another to kill the dragon and get the reward, but in our time that method had gone out, and the priest had become the one that abolished dragons. Père Guillaume Fronte did it in this case. He had a procession with candles and incense and banners, and marched around the edge of the wood and exorcised the dragon, and it was never heard of again, although it was the opinion of many that the smell never wholly passed away. Not that any had ever smelt the smell again, for none had. It was only an opinion, like that other, and lacked bones, you see. I know that the creature was there before the exorcism, but whether it was there afterward or not is a thing which I cannot be so positive about. In a noble open space carpeted with grass, on the high ground toward Vaucouleurs, stood a most majestic beech-tree with wide-reaching arms and a grand spread of shade, and by it a limpid spring of cold water, and on summer days the children went there, every summer for more than 500 years, went there and sang and danced around the tree for hours together, refreshing themselves at the spring from time to time, and it was most lovely and enjoyable. Also they made wreaths of flowers, and hung them upon the tree and about the spring to please the fairies that lived there, for they liked that, being idle innocent little creatures, as all fairies are, and fond of anything delicate and pretty like wild flowers put together in that way. And in return for this attention the fairies did any friendly thing they could for the children, such as keeping the spring always full and clear and cold, and driving away serpents and insects that sting. And so there was never any unkindness between the fairies and the children during more than 500 years. Tradition said 1,000, but only the warmest affection and the most perfect trust and confidence. And whenever a child died, the fairies mourned just as that child's playmates did, and the sign of it was there to see. For before the dawn on the day of the funeral they hung a little immortelle over the place where that child was used to sit under the tree. I know this to be true by my own eyes. It is not hearsay, and the reason it was known that the fairies did it was this, that it was made all of black flowers of a sort not known in France anywhere. Now, from time immemorial, all children reared in Domremy were called the children of the tree, and they loved that name, for it carried with it a mystic privilege not granted to any others of the children of this world, which was this: whenever one of these came to die, then beyond the vague and formless images drifting through his darkening mind rose soft and rich and fair a vision of the tree, if all was well with his soul. That was what some said. Others said the vision came in two ways: once as a warning, 1 or 2 years in advance of death, when the soul was the captive of sin, and then the tree appeared in its desolate winter aspect. Then that soul was smitten with an awful fear. If repentance came, and purity of life, the vision came again, this time summer-clad and beautiful. But if it were otherwise with that soul, the vision was withheld, and it passed from life knowing its doom. Still others said that the vision came but once, and then only to the sinless dying forlorn in distant lands and pitifully longing for some last dear reminder of their home. And what reminder of it could go to their hearts like the picture of the tree, that was the darling of their love and the comrade of their joys and comforter of their small griefs, all through the divine days of their vanished youth? Now the several traditions were as I have said, some believing one, and some another. One of them I knew to be the truth, and that was the last one. I do not say anything against the others. I think they were true, but I only know that the last one was, and it is my thought that if one keep to the things he knows, and not trouble about the things which he cannot be sure about, he will have the steadier mind for it, and there is profit in that. I know that when the children of the tree die in a far land, then, if they be at peace with God, they turn their longing eyes toward home, and there, far shining, as through a rift in a cloud that curtains heaven, they see the soft picture of the fairy tree clothed in a dream of golden light, and they see the bloomy mead sloping away to the river, and to their perishing nostrils is blown faint and sweet the fragrance of the flowers of home. And then the vision fades and passes, but they know, and by their transfigured faces you know also, you who stand looking on. Yes, you know the message that has come, and that it has come from heaven. Joan and I believed alike about this matter, but Pierre Morel and Jacques d'Arc and many others believed that the vision appeared twice to a sinner. In fact, they and many others said they knew it, probably because their fathers had known it and had told them, for one gets most things at second hand in this world. Now, one thing that does make it quite likely that there were really two apparitions of the tree is this fact. From the most ancient times, if one saw a villager of ours with his face ash-white and rigid with a ghastly fright, it was common for every one to whisper to his neighbor, "Ah, he is in sin and has got his warning." And the neighbor would shudder at the thought and whisper back, "Yes, poor soul, he has seen the tree." Such evidences as these have their weight. They are not to be put aside with a wave of the hand. A thing that is backed by the cumulative evidence of centuries naturally gets nearer and nearer to being proof all the time. And if this continue and continue, it will some day become authority, and authority is a bedded rock and will abide. In my long life I have seen several cases where the tree appeared announcing a death which was still far away, but in none of these was the person in a state of sin. No, the apparition was in these cases only a special grace. In place of deferring the tidings of that soul's redemption till the day of death, the apparition brought them long before, and with them peace, peace that might no more be disturbed, the eternal peace of God. I myself, old and broken, wait with serenity, for I have seen the vision of the tree. I have seen it, and am content. Always, from the remotest times, when the children joined hands and danced around the fairy tree, they sang a song which was the tree's song, the song of L'Arbre Fée de Burmung. They sang it to a quaint sweet air, a solacing sweet air which has gone murmuring through my dreaming spirit all my life when I was weary and troubled, resting me and carrying me through night and distance home again. No stranger can know or feel what that song has been through the drifting centuries to exiled children of the tree, homeless and heavy of heart in countries foreign to their speech and ways. You will think it a simple thing, that song, and poor perchance, But if you will remember what it was to us, and what it brought before our eyes when it floated through our memories, then you will respect it, and you will understand how the water wells up in our eyes and makes all things dim, and our voices break, and we cannot sing the last lines. And when, in exile's wandering, we shall fainting yearn for glimpse of thee, oh, rise upon our sight. And you will remember that Joan of Arc sang this song with us around the tree when she was a little girl, and always loved it. And that hallows it, yes, you will grant that. L'Arbre fait de Bourlemont, Song of the Children. Now what has kept your leaves so green, Arbre fait de Bourlemont? The children's tears. They brought each grief, and you did comfort them and cheer their bruised hearts, and steal a tear that healed rose a leaf. And what has built you up so strong, Arbre fait de Bourlemont? The children's love. They've loved you long, 100 years, in sooth. They've nourished you with praise and song, and warmed your heart and kept it young, 1,000 years of youth. Bide always green in our young hearts, Arbre fait de Bourlemont, and we shall always youthful be, not heeding time his flight. And when, in exile wandering, we shall fainting yearn for glimpse of thee, oh, rise upon our sight. The fairies were still there when we were children, but we never saw them, because 100 years before that, the priest of Domremy had held a religious function under the tree and denounced them as being blood kin to the fiend, and barred them from redemption. And then he warned them never to show themselves again, nor hang any more immortelles, on pain of perpetual banishment from that parish. All the children pleaded for the fairies, and said they were their good friends and dear to them, and never did them any harm. But the priest would not listen, and said it was sin and shame to have such friends. The children mourned and could not be comforted, and they made an agreement among themselves that they would always continue to hang flower wreaths on the tree, as a perpetual sign to the fairies that they were still loved and remembered, though lost to sight. But late one night a great misfortune befell. Edmond Aubry's mother passed by the tree, and the fairies were stealing a dance, not thinking anybody was by. And they were so busy, and so intoxicated with the wild happiness of it, and with the bumpers of dew sharpened up with honey which they had been drinking, that they noticed nothing. So Dame Aubry stood there astonished and admiring, and saw the little fantastic atoms holding hands, as many as 300 of them, tearing around in a great ring half as big as an ordinary bedroom, and leaning away back and spreading their mouths with laughter and song, which she could hear quite distinctly, and kicking their legs up as much as 3 inches from the ground in perfect abandon and hilarity. Oh, the very maddest and witchingest dance the woman ever saw. But in about a minute or 2 minutes the poor little ruined creatures discovered her. They burst out in one heart-breaking squeak of grief and terror, and fled every which way, with their wee hazel-nut fists in their eyes and crying, and so disappeared. The heartless woman, no, the foolish woman, she was not heartless, but only thoughtless, went straight home and told the neighbors all about it, whilst we, the small friends of the fairies, were asleep, and not witting the calamity that was come upon us, and all unconscious that we ought to be up and trying to stop these fatal tongues. In the morning everybody knew, and the disaster was complete, for where everybody knows a thing, the priest knows it, of course. We all flocked to Père Fronte, crying and begging, and he had to cry too, seeing our sorrow, for he had a most kind and gentle nature, and he did not want to banish the fairies, and said so, but said he had no choice, for it had been decreed that if they ever revealed themselves to man again, they must go. This all happened at the worst time possible, for Joan of Arc was ill of a fever and out of her head, and what could we do who had not her gifts of reasoning and persuasion? We flew in a swarm to her bed and cried out, "Joan, wake! Wake, there is no moment to lose. Come and plead for the fairies. Come and save them. Only you can do it." But her mind was wandering. She did not know what we said nor what we meant. So we went away, knowing all was lost. Yes, all was lost, forever lost. The faithful friends of the children for 500 years must go, and never come back any more. It was a bitter day for us, that day that Père Fronte held the function under the tree and banished the fairies. We could not wear mourning that any could have noticed. It would not have been allowed. So we had to be content with some poor small rag of black tied upon our garments where it made no show. But in our hearts we wore mourning, big and noble and occupying all the room, for our hearts were ours. They could not get at them to prevent that. The great tree, l'Arbre Fée de Bourlemont was its beautiful name, was never afterward quite as much to us as it had been before, but it was always dear, is dear to me yet when I go there now, once a year in my old age, to sit under it and bring back the lost playmates of my youth, and group them about me, and look upon their faces through my tears, and break my heart, oh my God! No, the place was not quite the same afterward. In one or two ways it could not be, for the fairies' protection being gone, the spring lost much of its freshness and coldness, and more than 2/3 of its volume, and the banished serpents and stinging insects returned and multiplied, and became a torment, and have remained so to this day. When that wise little child Joan got well, we realized how much her illness had cost us, for we found that we had been right in believing she could save the fairies. She burst into a great storm of anger for so little a creature, and went straight to Père Fronte, and stood up before him where he sat, and made reverence, and said, "The fairies were to go if they showed themselves to people again, is it not so?" "Yes, that it was, dear." "If a man comes prying into a person's room at midnight when that person is half naked, will you be so unjust as to say that that person is showing himself to that man?" "Well, no." The good priest looked a little troubled and uneasy when he said it. "Is a sin anyway, even if one did not intend to commit it?" Père Fronte threw up his hands and cried out, "Oh, my poor little child, I see all my fault." And he drew her to his side and put an arm around her and tried to make his peace with her, but her temper was up so high that she could not get it down right away, but buried her head against his breast and broke out crying, and said, "Then the fairies committed no sin, for there was no intention to commit one, they not knowing that anyone was by, and because they were little creatures and could not speak for themselves, and say the law was against the intention, not against the innocent act, because they had no friend to think that simple thing for them and say it, they have been sent away from their home forever, and it was wrong to do it." The good father hugged her yet closer to his side, and said, "Oh, out of the mouths of babes and sucklings the heedless and unthinking are condemned. Would God I could bring the little creatures back for your sake, and mine, yes, and mine, for I have been unjust. There, don't cry. Nobody could be sorrier than your poor old friend. Don't cry, dear." "But I can't stop right away, I've got to. And it is no little matter, this thing that you have done. Is being sorry penance enough for such an act?" Père Fronte turned away his face, for it would have hurt her to see him laugh, and said, "Oh, thou remorseless but most just accuser, no, it is not. I will put on sackcloth and ashes. There, are you satisfied?" Joan's sobs began to diminish, and she presently looked up at the old man through her tears, and said, in her simple way, "Yes, that will do, if it will clear you." Père Fronte would have been moved to laugh again, perhaps, if he had not remembered in time that he had made a contract, and not a very agreeable one. It must be fulfilled, so he got up and went to the fireplace. Joan watched him with deep interest, and took a shovelful of cold ashes, and was going to empty them on his old gray head, when a better idea came to him, and he said, "Would you mind helping me, dear?" "How, father?" He got down on his knees and bent his head low, and said, "Take the ashes and put them on my head for me." The matter ended there, of course. The victory was with the priest. One can imagine how the idea of such a profanation would strike Joan or any other child in the village. She ran and dropped upon her knees by his side and said, "Oh, it is dreadful! I didn't know that that was what one meant by sackcloth and ashes. Do please get up, father." "But I can't until I am forgiven. Do you forgive me?" "I? Oh, you have done nothing to me, father. It is yourself that must forgive yourself for wrong-doing those poor things. Please get up, father, won't you?" "But I am worse off now than I was before. I thought I was earning your forgiveness, but if it is my own, I can't be lenient. It would not become me. Now what can I do? Find me some way out of this with your wise little head." The pair would not stir, for all Joan's pleadings. She was about to cry again. Then she had an idea, and seized the shovel and deluged her own head with the ashes, stammering out through her chokings and suffocations, "There, now it is done. Oh, please get up, father." The old man, both touched and amused, gathered her to his breast and said, "Oh, you incomparable child! It's a humble martyrdom, and not of a sort presentable in a picture, but the right and true spirit is in it. That I testify." Then he brushed the ashes out of her hair, and helped her scour her face and neck and properly tidy herself up. He was in fine spirits now, and ready for further argument. So he took his seat and drew Joan to his side again, and said, "Joan, you were used to make fairy wreaths there at the fairy tree with the other children, is it not so?" That was the way he always started out when he was going to corner me up and catch me in something, just that gentle, indifferent way that fools a person so, and leads him into the trap, he never noticing which way he is traveling until he is in, and the door shut on him. He enjoyed that. I knew he was going to drop corn along in front of Joan now. Joan answered, "Yes, father." "Did you hang them on the tree?" "No, father." "Didn't hang them there?" "No." "Why didn't you?" Well, I didn't wish to." "Didn't wish to?" "No, father." "What did you do with them?" "I hung them in the church." "Why didn't you want to hang them in the tree?" "Because it was said that the fairies were of kin to the fiend, and that it was sinful to show them honor." "Did you believe it was wrong to honor them so?" "Yes, I thought it must be wrong." "Then if it was wrong to honor them in that way, and if they were of kin to the fiend, they could be dangerous company for you and the other children, couldn't they?" "I suppose so. Yes, I think so." He studied a minute, and I judged he was going to spring his trap, and he did. He said, "Then the matter stands like this. They were banned creatures of fearful origin. They could be dangerous company for the children. Now give me a rational reason, dear, if you can think of any, why you call it a wrong to drive them into banishment, and why you would have saved them from it. In a word, what loss have you suffered by it?" How stupid of him to go and throw his case away like that. I could have boxed his ears for vexation if he had been a boy. He was going along all right until he ruined everything by winding up in that foolish and fatal way. What had she lost by it? Was he never going to find out what kind of a child Joan of Arc was? Was he never going to learn that things which merely concerned her own gain or loss she cared nothing about? Could he never get the simple fact into his head that the sure way and the only way to rouse her up and set her on fire was to show her where some other person was going to suffer wrong or hurt or loss? Why, he had gone and set a trap for himself. That was all he had accomplished. The minute those words were out of his mouth her temper was up, the indignant tears rose in her eyes, and she burst out on him with an energy and passion which astonished him, but didn't astonish me, for I knew he had fired a mine when he touched off his ill-chosen climax. "Oh, father, how can you talk like that? Who owns France?" "God and the king." "Not Satan?" Satan, my child, this is the footstool of the Most High. Satan owns no handful of its soil. Then who gave those poor creatures their home? God. Who protected them in it all those centuries? God. Who allowed them to dance and play there all those centuries and found no fault with it? God. Who disapproved of God's approval and put a threat upon them? A man. Who caught them again in harmless sports that God allowed and a man forbade, and carried out that threat, and drove the poor things away from the home the good God gave them in his mercy and his pity, and sent down his rain and dew and sunshine upon it 500 years in token of his peace? It was their home, theirs, by the grace of God and his good heart, and no man had a right to rob them of it. And they were the gentlest, truest friends that children ever had, and did them sweet and loving service all these 5 long centuries, and never any hurt or harm. And the children loved them, and now they mourn for them, and there is no healing for their grief. And what had the children done that they should suffer this cruel stroke? The poor fairies could have been dangerous company for the children? Yes, but never had been, and could is no argument. Kinsmen of the fiend? What of it? Kinsmen of the fiend have rights, and these had, and children have rights, and these had, and if I had been there I would have spoken. I would have begged for the children and the fiends, and stayed your hand and saved them all. But now, oh, now all is lost. Everything is lost, and there is no help more. Then she finished with a blast at that idea that fairy kinsmen of the fiend ought to be shunned and denied human sympathy and friendship, because salvation was barred against them. She said that for that very reason people ought to pity them, and do every humane and loving thing they could to make them forget the hard fate that had been put upon them by accident of birth and no fault of their own. "Poor little creatures," she said, "what can a person's heart be made of that can pity a Christian's child, and yet can't pity a devil's child, that 1,000 times more needs it?" She had torn loose from Père Front, and was crying, with her knuckles in her eyes and stamping her small feet in a fury, and now she burst out of the place, and was gone before we could gather our senses together out of this storm of words and this whirlwind of passion. The Père had got upon his feet toward the last, and now he stood there passing his hand back and forth across his forehead, like a person who is dazed and troubled. Then he turned and wandered toward the door of his little workroom, and as he passed through it I heard him murmur sorrowfully, "Ah me, poor children, poor fiends, they have rights, and she said true. I never thought of that. God forgive me, I am to blame." When I heard that, I knew I was right in the thought that he had set a trap for himself. It was so, and he had walked into it, you see. I seemed to feel encouraged, and wondered if mayhap I might get him into one, but upon reflection my heart went down, for this was not my gift. End of chapter 2.
All right. So the fairy tree is a beech tree full of fairies. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, and I mentioned several times before, that this book is the one that is the most fictionalized by Twain, and that is true. However, the fairy tree is real. The fairy tree is in the transcripts from the trial, and I link out to them in the show notes. So the fairy tree, a beech tree, B-E-E-C-H, so instead of a beach full of fairies being a B-E-A-C-H full of fairies, this is a B-E-E-C-H full of fairies. In the beginning of the trial, the prosecutors were trying to get Joan on a charge of witchcraft or consorting with the devil or, one of those good old chestnuts that they used so often. They'd gone back to her hometown and asked around and basically depositioned a lot of people trying to find some dirt on her. And this was the only thing they could find was the story about the mayor's wife, Aubrey, having a relationship with Joan. And they tried to pin a witchcraft charge on her so that Joan would be gotten on a guilty by association foundation, I guess. You can see Joan's responses. She is completely guileless. You can so see why Twain fell in love with her. She's absolutely honest. She is simple. She is plain spoken. She is straightforward. She is not playing around. And if you read all of the trials, what you start to see her do is she must be getting exhausted, because by day, 3, much less 4, 5, 6, or 7, they're trying to ask her the same questions to get her to trip up so that they can, but before you said at her. And instead, she would turn to the clerk and say, could you read back to them what I said yesterday, so that she can't be caught in that kind of trap. She's a smart cookie. So the fairy tree is real. The banishment of the fairies is real. The song is not real. That's pure Twain. But the name of the tree, L'arbre fée de Burmung, fée being fairies, l'arbre, the tree of the fairies, on Burmung's land, all in the transcripts. So song, not real. Everything else, kind of true. Conversation between Joan and the priest, fictionalized, but based heavily in what Twain read Joan say in her own trial. So her defense of the fairies as smaller people who can't speak for themselves, who need protection, who need a friend to speak up for them. Boy, is that foreshadowing. And then the priest's enormous misstep of bringing her personally into it. What have you suffered because the fairies are gone? That's not the right question. And Twain does, I think, a beautiful job of showing this kind of trap that the priest fell into and that priests in the future will fall into as well, and doing a good job of making it clear that Joan really is not out for herself, never was out for herself. This is something she is doing for others. Later, it will be a sacrifice she makes for the benefit of others. Here, it's the sacrifice of time and an argument with the priest, which is not for nothing. It would be a big deal for a kid. But then when she goes on to say, in response to his argument, the poor fairies could have been dangerous company for the children. Yes, but they never had been. And could is no argument. And then later she says, poor little creatures, what can a person's heart be made of that can pity a Christian's child and yet can't pity a devil's child that 1,000 times more needs it? I just get chills. I love that. I love that. I love Twain. I love Joan. I'm with him. It's not the best written book in the world, but it's so unique. And Joan is such a unique, I almost said character. It's weird to call her a character. I know that in the early chapters, she really is largely a construct of Twain based on her later factual information that comes out during the trials. But it's still hard to think of her as a character. And that's where we're going to leave it this week. I hope you have a great week. Take care of yourself. Take care of others. Be well. Be safe. I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye. If you like what you hear on CraftLit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is CraftLit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of CraftLit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.